You hear it before you see it. A silence so unnatural it gnaws at your chest. The kind of silence that follows after screams have been wrung dry. After resistance has already been swallowed whole. The wind carries smoke through the air. The bitter taste of charred wood and human flesh scratching your throat. The ground beneath your feet is slick, not with rain, but with the remnants of a city put to the sword. And yet, no clang of weapons greets your ear, no cries of men dying in battle. They are gone, every last one, cut down to the measure of a wagon wheel. What remains is not a battlefield. It is a stage for something darker. From the haze, figures emerge. Women. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Their eyes are wide but empty, fixed on the horizon as if to escape the hands that grip them. Children cling to their skirts, pulled away and cast aside like broken branches. The conquerors do not look at them as people. They look at them as spoils. As livestock to be divided, measured, branded, owned. You watch as the first line is formed. A grotesque procession where bodies are not spared, but counted. Teeth pried open to judge age, hands inspected for signs of nobility, wombs considered for their worth. The men in charge do not jeer or gloat. They write. They record. They turn women into columns on a ledger, another inventory to be distributed across an empire. This is not lust. This is not chaos. This is governance. And above it all, a shadow looms. The name carried in whispers and in terror. Not as a warrior on horseback, not as a unifier of tribes, not as the hero carved into monuments. But as something colder, more absolute. The man whose empire was built not only by the sword, but by the systematic violation of every boundary that makes us human. Genghis Khan. The name that echoes across centuries as conqueror, strategist, ruler. But beneath the gilded mask of history lies the truth no one wants to remember. The darkest legacy of them all. This is not about victories in battle. This is not about lands conquered or cities burned. This is about millions of lives scarred. This is about the empire of wombs. And the horror of survival when survival itself was a sentence. If you can stomach hearing truths that history books bury, then you belong here in Grim Histories. Don't just watch quietly, subscribe now. And if you choose not to, tell us in the comments why you'd rather silence the past. He was not born a monster. He was born Temujin, the son of a chieftain on the unforgiving Mongolian steppe. From the moment he could stand, he was taught the law of that vast and merciless land. Strength was survival, weakness was death. Women were taken as easily as horses, traded as currency between tribes, stolen as prizes in raids. Even his own mother had been abducted by his father, a practice so ordinary it barely merited a whisper in the oral histories. But destiny sharpened Temujin on a blade of grief. His father was poisoned, his family cast out by their clan, left to claw scraps from the frozen earth. Betrayal became his first tutor. Hunger became his companion. By the time he reached manhood, Temujin had learned that trust was an illusion and mercy was suicide. And yet, for a fleeting moment, he found something like hope. He married Börte, a woman whose beauty was matched by her lineage. She brought with her not only affection, but legitimacy, status, and alliances he desperately needed. With Börte, Temujin glimpsed a different future, one where love and power might walk hand in hand. That illusion shattered with the thunder of hooves at dawn. The Merkit tribe descended upon his camp, vengeance for a crime committed long before his birth. Decades earlier, Temujin's father had stolen a Merkit bride. In the cruel arithmetic of the steppe, that debt would now be repaid through Temujin's wife. As flames licked the horizon and warriors crashed through his camp, Temujin was faced with a choice: fight and die, or flee and live to avenge. He chose survival. Börte was torn from him, screaming, her body claimed as spoils of an ancient feud. For 9 months, she endured captivity. 9 months of being passed from one Merkit warrior to another, her body made into a battlefield, her womb into a weapon against her own husband's honor. When Temujin finally returned with allies to rescue her, Börte was visibly pregnant. The child could not be his. In the brutal logic of the steppe, this was the deepest emasculation. A man unable to protect his wife's womb was no man at all. Yet Temujin made a choice that confounded tradition. He accepted her back, claimed the child as his own, and stood by Börte's side. But acceptance is not the same as forgiveness. What brewed inside him was not peace, but poison. Observers recorded a shift in his character after Börte's return. The flickers of mercy he once showed vanished. Where before he might have spared an enemy, now he demanded annihilation. Where before he sought alliances, now he demanded submission. The man who had failed to prevent one rape resolved to control thousands. This was no longer about tribal custom. Temujin transformed sexual violence from an act of vengeance into an instrument of statecraft. Others before him had taken women, he would systematize it. Others had acted from passion or rage, he would act from policy. Börte's abduction had not only scarred him, it had written the blueprint for how he would scar the world. You're listening to what most would rather forget. If you're not subscribed, why? Is the truth too uncomfortable, or do you just take it without supporting those who dare uncover it? Comment your reason. The seeds have been planted, one man's wounded pride, one woman's suffering, an empire's shadow. From that moment forward, conquest would not simply mean territory or tribute. It would mean the destruction of bloodlines, the erasure of identity, the weaponization of intimacy itself. This was the birth of an obsession, and the first steps toward a system of horror that would span continents. Conquest under Temujin did not stop at swords, arrows, or fire. When his armies breached the walls of a city, the killing of men was only the first act. What followed was more deliberate, more intimate, and more enduring than death. Women were gathered into open squares, forced into lines that stretched as far as the eye could see. They were not treated as captives of war, but as resources to be assessed, sorted, and consumed. The Mongols devised what they called the sorting. It was not a random pillage, but a procedure. Women stood trembling as commanders inspected them like livestock. Teeth were pried open to judge age, hands examined for signs of noble blood, hymens checked for virginity. Their bodies became data points, their fates determined by categories scrawled into ledgers. The most beautiful, the young, the untouched, these were claimed by Genghis Khan himself and his senior generals. Slightly lower ranks of beauty and age were assigned to lesser officers. Others were parceled out to the common soldiers. Some were branded, some tagged with markers indicating their place in this grotesque hierarchy. Nothing was left to chance. Every rank knew how many women he was entitled to. Records were kept as carefully as inventories of arrows and horses. Grades were established. Grade A, young, beautiful virgins, reserved for the highest. Grade B, desirable women fit for officers. Grade C, older or less valued, given to common soldiers. Grade D, women considered too old or too plain to serve sexually, relegated to maintenance work in the camps. Every category had a purpose. Everybody was slotted into the machinery. Ethnic cataloging sharpened the cruelty further. Persian women were noted for their fertility, Chinese women prized for skill in crafts and music, Slavic women sought for their appearance. The Mongols recorded not just faces, but bloodlines, tracking which conquered peoples were considered most useful to breed into the empire. This was not rape born of impulse. It was rape codified, organized, and administered as policy. This cold efficiency was unique in scale, but not in spirit. Rome paraded captive women in triumphal processions before absorbing them into slavery. The Ottoman Empire established harems stocked with girls from conquered lands, chosen by age and beauty. Centuries later, Japan built the system of comfort women in World War II, where thousands of girls were forced into brothels for soldiers. Yet even among these horrors, the Mongol system stood apart. Others concealed their crimes in euphemism, the Mongols logged theirs like taxes, their empire sustained as much by wombs as by weapons. Imagine the terror of a mother in one of those lines. She knows that beauty is both a curse and a death sentence. She may pray her daughter looks plain, prays she looks sickly, prays for anything that will spare her from the gaze of the commanders. But prayers fall on the dust. Once the ledgers are filled, the allocations are made, there is no appeal. A life reduced to an entry in a ledger. This was not the chaos of raiders drunk on bloodlust. This was organized evil. And if you value hearing history's ugliest truths told without mercy, subscribe. If not, let us know in the comments why this knowledge doesn't deserve your support. The system spread like veins through the empire. Selection centers were erected outside conquered cities, where women were brought for initial inspection. Medical officers checked for disease. Scribes documented names, ages, and ethnic origins. Those selected for high-ranking Mongols were separated at once, while the rest were packed into wagons and transported across the steppe. Specialized caravans carried them from one outpost to another, guarded by men rewarded with the right to claim any woman who tried to flee. The empire became a vast machine of sexual exploitation. Way stations along the Mongol postal system doubled as nodes of forced prostitution, ensuring that every traveler of rank had access to women. Larger military brothels were built like barracks, with corridors designed to prevent escapes, inspection rooms where men could select their victims, and punishment cells for those who resisted. The efficiency is haunting. The Mongols transformed rape into logistics, into paperwork, into infrastructure. They stripped it of passion, of chaos, of even the pretense of spontaneity. They made it governance. The sword was only half the weapon. What truly reshaped the world was what followed after the killing stopped. To annihilate a people, the Mongols knew, you did not need to erase every life, you needed only to erase the men, then claim the wombs of the women. The Tatars were the first to learn this truth in its most brutal form. When Genghis Khan's armies crushed their resistance, he issued an order chilling in its precision: every Tatar male taller than the height of a wagon wheel was to be executed. Boys scarcely older than 5 were struck down alongside warriors. The women and girls were spared, but not to rebuild their nation. They were parceled out among Mongol soldiers with a single instruction: to bear children not of Tatar blood, but of Mongol lineage. Within a generation, the Tatar people existed only through female descent, their identity broken, their bloodline diluted into the empire. The Tanguts faced a cruelty even more perverse. In their case, some men were left alive, but castrated. Forced to watch as their wives and daughters were systematically impregnated, their agony was not only physical but psychological. They became witnesses to the erasure of their own people, guardians of a lineage that would never continue. It was genocide conducted not in fire, but in flesh. This was genetic warfare centuries before the term existed. While other conquerors demanded tribute or hostages, the Mongols demanded bloodlines. They sought to overwrite entire nations in their own image. The consequences can still be measured today. Geneticists estimate that nearly 16 million men alive now descend directly from Genghis Khan or his close male relatives, around 0.5% of the global male population, and as high as 8% in regions once under his control. This is not natural chance. It is the fingerprint of systematic sexual violence carried out across continents. Each statistic is not just a number, but the echo of thousands of rapes, thousands of lives bent under the will of empire. And the scars were not only genetic. They were cultural. Families across Asia restructured their very lives to shield women from Mongol predation. In China, the practice of foot binding accelerated, an attempt to make daughters less mobile, less appealing to raiders. In the Islamic world, purdah, the strict seclusion of women, grew harsher, as veils and walls became shields against violation. Architecture itself changed. Homes were built with hidden chambers, passageways, and false walls to conceal women when the riders came. Some families made even more desperate choices. Protective infanticide spread, baby girls quietly suffocated rather than left to grow into prey. Others scarred their daughters' faces deliberately, disfiguring beauty to save them from selection lines. Communities devised rituals for early marriage, believing that a woman bound by vows might be granted slightly less cruelty if captured. In every corner of the empire's reach, survival twisted culture into new, defensive shapes. Modern science has uncovered an even darker echo. Along the old Mongol conquest routes, researchers have documented genetic bottlenecks, shrunken pools of diversity that speak of populations decimated, their men extinguished, their women folded into a conqueror's line. Some disorders appear at higher frequency in these regions, legacies of narrowed ancestry and forced reproduction. It is biology itself testifying to atrocity, the body carrying what the chronicles only hint at. Every statistic here represents unimaginable suffering. If you can listen and not subscribe to Grim Histories, you're taking the voices of victims for free. If that's you, say so in the comments, explain why their stories don't deserve remembrance. This was not simply the story of one man's obsession. It was the reshaping of humanity through the violation of its most sacred bond, the bond between parent and child, lineage and legacy. The Mongols did not just conquer territory. They conquered ancestry, replanting their seed where once whole nations had stood. And in that twisted harvest, millions today still unknowingly carry the shadow of a crime committed 8 centuries ago. Conquest was never blind. For the Mongols, the higher a woman's birth, the more useful her violation. It was not enough to crush a people in battle. To break their spirit entirely, their nobility had to be paraded in shame. When a kingdom surrendered, its rulers were often commanded to hand over daughters as tribute. These young women, raised behind silk screens, dressed in gold and brocade, suddenly found themselves displayed before Mongol generals like cattle at market. The gift was never symbolic. It was consummated by force, a public demonstration that no dynasty, no throne, no sacred lineage could shield its women. Princesses and queens were stripped of their status in the most literal way. Some were raped in front of their subjects, their humiliation performed as theater. In one kingdom after another, the message was clear: your rulers cannot protect their own blood, so how can they protect yours? The act was not only personal, it was political, a weapon designed to collapse loyalty at its root. Entire systems were devised to process women of noble birth. Special breeding centers emerged where aristocratic captives were kept separate from common women. These compounds were not mere harems, but controlled environments where high-born women were impregnated deliberately, their children destined to carry both the prestige of conquered blood and the dominance of Mongol seed. In the empire's logic, even royal wombs could be turned into factories for legitimacy. The daughters of kings and emperors, once considered untouchable, became trophies. Their blood was reduced to ornamentation for an empire that thrived on degradation. A queen who once commanded servants might be forced to serve the concubines of a Mongol officer. A princess who grew up in palaces might find herself catalogued in a ledger, reduced to grade A stock in a system colder than slavery. The evidence of this cruelty is not confined to manuscripts. Archaeology has uncovered burial sites across Asia where the remains tell their own silent testimonies. Mass graves contain disproportionate numbers of young women, their bones scarred by repeated pregnancies at short intervals, their bodies showing signs of malnutrition and untreated disease. Some were interred without ceremony, discarded like refuse. Others, perhaps once royal, were buried hastily, their jewelry still clasped to their brittle wrists, proof that they were not honored in death, only abandoned. You've heard of kings and queens in fairy tales. Here, royalty was broken as an example. If this makes you realize history isn't glorious but grotesque, prove it, subscribe. If not, comment and tell us why you'd rather keep pretending. The spectacle of violated royalty served its purpose. It whispered to the commoner that if the blood of kings could be spilled so cheaply, what chance did anyone else have? It told the defeated that their gods, their ancestors, their dynasties had failed. And in that silence of belief, the Mongols reigned unchallenged. But beneath the crushing weight of the empire, seeds of resistance still stirred, waiting for their chance to strike back in ways history tried to erase. Resistance did not always roar with armies or banners. Sometimes it whispered, hidden in the cracks of despair, carried on the breath of women who refused to surrender their last fragments of power. In the shadow of an empire that sought to erase them, silence itself became a weapon. Among the captives, knowledge was traded like contraband. Women passed herbs from hand to hand, roots and leaves that could prevent pregnancy, or end one before it took hold. In the camps where they were forced into breeding stock, these plants became secret guardians. A miscarriage was not a tragedy, but an act of rebellion, a refusal to let the conqueror write his legacy into their bodies. Mothers whispered instructions in the night, teaching daughters which herbs to chew, which teas to boil, which seeds to swallow when no one was watching. Language, too, became a tool of survival. Captives taught one another fragments of Mongolian, not to obey, but to manipulate. A kind word at the right moment could lessen a blow, delay an inspection, and trick a guard into small mercies. In groups, women rehearsed these phrases in whispers, creating a fragile shield against unrelenting cruelty. With each shared word, they reclaimed a measure of control. Sabotage crept into the machinery of the empire. Clothing meant to serve captors was sewn poorly, seams loosening in the cold. Food prepared in camp kitchens was sometimes spoiled just enough to sicken without killing. Minor acts, invisible to the record keepers, but sharp enough to remind the Mongols that domination was never complete. Yet in this landscape of quiet defiance, one story towered above all. The tale of Gerbal, a Tangut princess given as tribute, whose name is rarely written in the official histories but lives in whispers carried through generations. For 3 years, she endured what thousands endured, raped under the guise of concubinage, treated as another jewel in the Khan's collection. But unlicked. She studied the rhythms of her captor, the moments when wine dulled his vigilance, the nights when guards grew careless in storms. She wove thin shards of sharpened metal into her elaborate hair ornaments, testing them in secret on silk and meat. And on a night when thunder masked her movements and rain drove soldiers into shelter, she struck. As the Khan reached for her, she buried the weapon between his legs, twisting until blood spilled across the silks of his bed. The official chronicles never admit this. They claim he fell from a horse, that he sickened from wounds in battle, that illness struck him down. But among the women of the empire, another story spread. That one of their own had dared to strike at the most feared man in history, and for a moment had made him bleed as they had bled. Gerbal paid with her life, killed within hours, her body cast aside. Yet her defiance shook the foundations of the empire. From brothels to barracks, whispers of her act spread faster than the Mongols could silence them. Concubines hid sharpened pins in their hair. Guards looked twice before approaching. For the first time, fear flowed not only downward, but upward. The predator was reminded he could also become prey. Her story was not the only one. Records mention scattered suicides, women who chose fire or drowning over capture, denying the empire their wombs. Songs collected centuries later carry verses about nameless girls who smuggled knives under robes, who struck a guard before being cut down, who spat into the faces of generals as they died. These were not victories in the traditional sense. They did not stop the empire's expansion. But they burned like embers, small flames of defiance against a darkness that sought to consume everything. The chronicles rarely wrote them down. Male scribes had little interest in the resistance of the powerless. Yet those stories survived in lullabies, in prayers, in the hushed words of mothers to daughters. You are never as helpless as they want you to believe. The Mongol Empire prided itself on breaking people so thoroughly that no resistance remained. But in kitchens, in whispered songs, in the hidden herbs boiled into bitter teas, women fought back. Their war was not one of armies, but of survival, of preserving fragments of dignity, of ensuring that even in the face of empire, the human spirit would not be entirely extinguished. And though their names are lost to history, their defiance remains. For every woman who bent under the weight of the empire, another resisted in ways so small the world would never know. yet together they formed the invisible army that denied the Mongols total victory. They did not win battles. They did not redraw maps. But they preserved something far greater. They preserved the truth that even in the darkest chapters of history, resistance is never fully silenced. 8 centuries have passed, yet the shadow of the Mongol conquest has not faded. It lingers not only in the soil of ancient battlefields, but in the bodies of those alive today. Modern science has peeled back the silence of time, revealing the genetic scars left behind. DNA studies show that around 16 million men carry the Y chromosome of Genghis Khan or his close relatives. That staggering number, 0.5% of the world's male population, is not the mark of natural growth. It is the evidence of rape scaled to empire. It is proof that entire generations of women bore children not of choice, but of conquest. The genetic impact is visible not just in numbers, but in patterns. In Central Asia, some regions show 30 to 40% of men carrying Mongol lineage. In others, the absence of diversity points to population collapses so severe that entire bloodlines vanished in a single generation. Where chronicles fall silent, genetics speaks. The bottlenecks reveal where men were wiped out and women absorbed, where annihilation was disguised as assimilation. Even certain disorders and inherited conditions trace along the paths of Mongol expansion, remnants of narrowed ancestry forced upon millions. But genetics is only half the story. The cultural wounds endured far longer than the empire itself. In China, foot binding surged as families sought to make daughters less appealing, less mobile, less vulnerable to raiders. In the Islamic world, seclusion hardened. Börte became a prison meant to hide women from the gaze of conquerors. Architecture was reshaped, hidden chambers, false walls, underground passages built into homes to conceal wives and daughters when the threat of horsemen loomed. Survival rewrote traditions, and those traditions became culture. Marriage customs twisted into shields. Girls were married younger, with the hope that a husband's claim might offer some protection. Contracts began to include clauses for what would happen if a bride was taken, early divorces, provisions for children conceived in captivity. Communities developed rituals to cleanse women who returned from Mongol hands, though most were never truly reintegrated. The trauma of captivity followed them like a brand, reshaping family honor and inheritance for generations. And the echoes of Mongol cruelty do not rest in history. They resound in modern times. In Bosnia, women were imprisoned in rape camps during the wars of the 1990s, their bodies weaponized to shatter communities. ISIS revived the practice of sorting women, selling them in markets as sex slaves, branding them, moving them along networks of exploitation. The comfort women of World War II Japan bore the same bureaucratic efficiency as the Mongol camps, records, quotas, medical inspections. The methods change, but the pattern endures. Humanity has returned, again and again, to the same abyss. What the Mongols perfected was not an aberration, it was a template. The transformation of sexual violence from individual brutality into systemic governance. And each time history repeats, the world insists it is unprecedented, when in truth it is only an old scar torn open anew. This is why the legacy matters. Not because it is confined to the 13th century, but because its echoes reach us still, in genetics, in culture, in the very architecture of our homes and the unspoken fears that shape how societies guard their daughters. The Mongols taught the world how to industrialize violation, and too often, humanity has been eager to relearn the lesson. Every statistic, every cultural shift, every scar in the DNA is testimony. Testimony that the womb was turned into a battlefield, that survival itself was twisted into surrender. If you can hear this and not recognize its weight, you are choosing to look away. And if you can listen and not subscribe to Grim Histories, you're taking the voices of victims for free. If that's you, say so in the comments, explain why their stories don't deserve remembrance. The empire of Genghis Khan is gone, but the damage it wrought remains etched into flesh, into stone, into ritual. It is a reminder that history's darkest horrors are never fully buried. They live on in the faces of descendants, in the customs of nations, in the repetition of crimes we swore we would never commit again. And until we confront them without flinching, they will return. He is remembered in marble, in statues, in textbooks that praise his genius. His name crowns airports, his likeness stamped on currency. In Mongolia, Genghis Khan is revered as the great ancestor, the man who carved an empire from the dust of the steppe. His legend is polished until it gleams, a unifier, a strategist, a hero of nationhood. But for the millions who lived under his shadow, there was no glory. Their voices were not carved into monuments. They were silenced, erased, scattered in shallow graves and forgotten rituals. The women whose bodies became borders, whose wombs became battlefields, whose children bore the faces of their enemies, they left no chronicles of triumph, only the scars written into bloodlines and traditions. History remembers the conqueror. It buries the conquered. This is the paradox. A man exalted as a builder of civilization, when so much of his empire was erected on the wreckage of human dignity. An ancestor celebrated, even as his legacy is carried unwillingly in the DNA of millions whose forebears were forced into submission. Every monument that honors him casts a shadow over the countless unnamed who endured him. It is easier to remember battles and victories than to face what was done in silence behind the walls of captured cities. Easier to tell stories of banners and cavalry than to confront the truth of ledgers that counted women like rations. Easier to venerate the conqueror than to grieve with the victims. That is why history is often written as triumph. And that is why Grim Histories exists, to speak where others stay silent, to remember what others erase, to give weight to the lives reduced to statistics and whispers. Because the empire of Genghis Khan did crumble. His dynasty splintered, his monuments faded, his empire vanished into the dust. But the scars remain, in architecture, in customs, in the genome of nations, in the cultural memory of peoples who still flinch at the echo of hoofbeats. His conquest ended, but the consequences did not. They live on. And so the question is not about him. It is about us. Will we continue to polish the legend and ignore the horror? Will we look at the empire he built and call it glory, or will we see it for what it truly was, a monument of suffering whose foundations were the bodies of the powerless? Genghis Khan's empire crumbled, but the scars remain in our blood and culture. If you believe these truths must be told, subscribe to Grim Histories. If you refuse, then speak in the comments. Why choose silence in the face of history's loudest screams?